You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. Thanks for checking back in to this special Encore series as we revisit equitable policing during the coronavirus pandemic. Part 2 continues with a question from moderator Ganesha Martin to the panelists about policing in communities with strained relationships and how law enforcement can make amends, followed by questions from the original viewing audience. And now for part 2 of equitable policing during the coronavirus pandemic.
Chuck Wexler of Perth recently said, community policing is supposed to be about engaging with the public, about building relationships. Having to break up a basketball game or tell people who are hanging out together that they have to disperse inherently causes a certain degree of tension. Asking police officers to go into Black and brown communities where the pandemic hit the hardest and where relationships are already strained could be argued hurts community policing efforts. How do you grapple with that issue or see it brought to bear in your work? What advice do you have for law enforcement to balance in carrying out these orders and not further eroding community trust? And Officer Sabota, you spend your days in the Houston community trying to figure out ways to bring folks together around some of these issues. Have you had to encounter some of these issues and grapple with them? And if so, how have you been able to handle that in Houston?
Very good question, and I want to thank you. Houston is a very diverse city. I'm born and raised, low income, multicultural diversity town. Your question, and to answer that is, we have a lot of great training. Our police chief and the command staff insist that we have a lot of training. Now, the last 6 months in my 35 years is a total different game. And we have had so many policies in place that officers, whether you have 5 years or 30 years, that we have to adapt to. And going as far as the program that I run is the Positive Interaction Program. Every single station has officers that deals with these issues, with the people that are home. Maybe they lost their job. Maybe they're having arguments with their family members. And sometimes the family members call the police. So officers have to respond to these issues that we've never had before in the city. And, tempers start going. People maybe start drinking alcohol, so their behavior changes. So what we're seeing is we're having more calls for service, and the spike for, I wouldn't say crime, but calls for service because people are at home. So I'm training officers in the academy, whether you're in the academy or you have many, many years on. There's one word that I use. It's called patience. And next is training. We have very good training here. Now, as we all know, and those of you who maybe don't know, that George Floyd was from Houston. And then, of course, when we had the protest, we had a very big protest in the city of Houston. Our chief and command staff took charge, and they actually walked with the protesters. So I'm getting so many phone calls and going out to the community and dealing with. We have learned this in my 35 years, we're learning something very important in the new policing, and that is listening to people. Now, growing up as a kid in the 60s and even into the 70s, I remember, police officers really did not ever interact with your average person. They ran a call for service, they arrested somebody, put them in jail, and they went back out. So they did not have very good rapport with the public. That has changed, specifically in the last 6 months. So I guess to sort of briefly answer your question is training. It's very, very important. And with officers that have been around for a while, we've got to almost, I would say, retrain them, but we have new policies and procedures dealing with this COVID and also any other type of police tension.
Professor or Judge, do you have any comment on that question?
Well, sorry, Professor.
That's okay. Go ahead.
I moved it first. Well, just to get back to something the professor said, I don't disagree basically with anything that you just said, in terms of the disparity in policing and racial biases. I mean, that's an issue. And I do believe that all these confluence of events highlighted this. I agree with that. And, the question is, how we deal with that going forward. But to get to your question, Ms. Martin, I think that in addition to what Officer Sabota said, it's not only training, but we have to teach police officers, and it's difficult to do this, but they have to use better discretion. I mean, the incident that Professor Calloway just referenced with the $350,000 for basically a not following social protocol, that's ridiculous. And frankly, that's something, I don't want to say this, but that's almost sanctionable. That's ridiculous. I mean, that is absolutely ridiculous. But when you have incidents like that, that kind of like messes up everybody's perception, or makes it more difficult to achieve that synergy between the community and police. A lot of times police officers, we had a case in New York City. I don't want to talk too much about it. I don't know if there's a lawsuit going on, but there was an incident that involved not wearing a mask. And while the police were very patient in dealing with this individual, eventually there was an arrest because this particular person hit a cop. All right, you can't do that. All right, but on the other hand, one would say, well, just let it go. But when you give police officers a task, so this is, police, the paramilitary organizations, when you give them a task, they're going to do the best to carry out the task. And in doing that, I find that I've only been here a year and a half to NYPD, but I find that a lot of times things can be avoided if you just look the other way. You don't, just because you can do something, that doesn't mean you have to. I mean, what Professor Calloway said, going to somebody's house and raising that to the level that was described, I mean, that was ridiculous. That's not, you can't even argue in favor. Like, I'm sure there's another side of that. Somebody will say, well, that didn't happen. But as described, that's not even defensible. So I do believe that if nothing else, this whole idea of this whole COVID thing has brought to the fore, what is the role of the police? The police are called for everything, whether it's domestic disputes, whether it's somebody had a drug overdose, social distancing and wearing masks, and somebody's having a psychological psychotic episode, call the police. So that's still, and rightfully, the discussions about whether or not the police should be involved in this is real. However, you can't make snap decisions. I mean, for example, New York City has taken a lot of time and effort to, when there's a person that's having some kind of psychotic episode, New York City has taken pains to notify the police officers that person may have a history, because they want to be, they should be informed about what's going on. So the other argument is, well, send, social workers or whatever. And that's all well and good, but you're not going to get social workers to respond to that until they feel that they're safe. So yes, good discussion, but the solution isn't necessarily easy.
Yeah, the solution is definitely not easy. And I think there's two components to it. There is a big picture solution, like should we defund the police? Do we need police in our community? Whatever that conversation is. And then there's also, well, what can we do right now about this situation? And I actually just had a conversation with a police officer the other day talking about some individual who was drunk in front of a store, and he went and got him and arrested him and took him to jail for disorderly conduct. And I said, do you ever just think take him home? And he looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language, like, well, no, I mean, I don't think my captain would like me to just take people home when they're committing crimes. And so it's like, I don't know if officers aren't empowered to do that or if they just don't think about doing it, but not everything needs to result in an arrest and someone going to jail. But the officers I interact with certainly don't seem to be able to either have the power to make those decisions or the thought process to come up with some other kind of solution to a simple problem like that.
Yeah, and here's the thing that I'll say, and then I'll segue us. I think, Professor, you hit on a very important point. And it's something that the judge brought up as well, is this issue of discretion. I know that at some of the police departments I've worked with, that the legal department would have told them an intoxicated person, you don't know what they're intoxicated on or with, for you to take them home and leave them there creates liability on us that we do not want. And so, it's not, and we have a question from Stephen and Leganke, if I'm saying that correctly, about the influence that the media has on some of these conversations. I think how I've been describing is as the adults, and I don't mean the police, the adults, the lawyers, the politicians, the county executives, the mayors, everybody needs to get together and actually take a step back and say, how do we empower? How do we make it very clear? Because one of the things that we're not going to talk about here on this panel is, if you ask a lot of police, they are worried about their own justice inside of the police department, such that if they do something outside of policy, or that their captain or their lieutenant or their sergeant does not condone, then who's going to have their back when they decide of their own discretion that maybe the best thing that they want to do out of their heart is to take that person home? But then when they show back up tomorrow, is the structure inside of the police department going to support that, or have them hang out to dry? And that's a real issue. And so I think, again, having these conversations with all of the different voices at the table that ask those straight questions like you just put forward, so that the training that we're doing, the policies that we put together, actually empower police to do the things that they need. The last thing I'll say is, often, unfortunately, police are not involved in the policy decisions that are made that affect them on the front lines. So I think that's something else that needs to happen, is not only the community voice needs to be brought in, but the police voice needs to be brought in, because you often, to your point, create policies that actually don't empower them to be the community officer that everybody's saying that they want. So I'll put this out there. I'll say my 2 cents on the media. I think, unfortunately, and I fought this battle in Baltimore, the clicks, is how they stay in business. People do not click on community police event, basketball, everybody's happy. They click on 12 dead, they click on police brutality, they click on these things. And so I think the media plays a huge, even this defund conversation. The truth of the matter is, the community and the police actually believe the same thing about the defund conversation to a certain degree, but nobody's talking about that middle ground. So I believe the media plays a huge part, and that they'll continue to be divisive, and it's going to be hard to work with them. The question is, there is a way to partner with them to ensure the public sees the positive as well as the highlighted needs for change. Does anybody have anything else to add to what I've said?
I do. Generally speaking, I don't think we have a problem in our society with people having a negative view of the police. I understand that there's some headlines and there's some communities where the police are not liked, but overall, I don't think there's a group of people that are more beloved in our country than police officers. And so I disagree about the media. I mean, yes, they're driven by clicks and a lot of that, but they do an amazing service for our community by telling us when these things are happening. I think that by putting out there when the police are shooting unarmed Black men, that's really important. And people in our community need to know about that. And while that's only been in the forefront the last few years because there hasn't been video evidence of it, it's been happening for a really long time. And so now in 2020, we're finally, after 200 years, able to have a conversation about structural racism and police use of force and what that's looking like and the harms that are coming to our society. And so I think that the reason we get to have those conversations a lot is because the media is sort of driving those conversations. So yeah, I think that they're playing an important role here. And I don't think that the police are, I mean, you know, anytime I'm in trial, so this is just anecdotal, but if a police officer walks in a uniform and says something, it doesn't matter if I have him on video saying something else, the jurors are going to believe what the police officer says. So putting a uniform on and walking around in the community carries an enormous amount of power. The public supports the police. And so because that's true, I think there's even more of an onus on the public and on people who care about what's happening to make sure that that responsibility is being taken seriously and not abused. I don't think that there's a perception problem. I think there's an actual problem with our police in general.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. And I will say, I think to your point that it's important for this to be a national conversation because the state's attorneys in Baltimore have the complete opposite, time when.
Fair enough.
All right. So, anyone else on that? I'm going to skip to our next question.
Yes, Ms. Martin. This is Chief Balling I'm from Sydney Police Department and also represent Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police.
Well,
I think there's room for improvement. We're talking about the COVID situation and the other situations going on. In law enforcement, we can definitely improve. But I think what's going on also is we're treated like a political football right now. We are the spearhead. We're the point of all this dynamics coming forward with this, with different views. When you're a young man and you start on a department, you'll find out that everyone loves the fireman, but everyone hates a police officer because we're called when people are dealing with the worst situations or when they're arrested or you have to take a family member away. The COVID situation has heightened some of this dynamics because we're not able to get out in the field and talk with people. During these demonstrations, we need to be out there. Law enforcement needs to be out working with the demonstrators, talking about the issues, because the only way you build trust is through conversations. People have perceptions. I'm sure all 5 of us on this panel have perceptions about what is right and what is wrong. But until you have those honest conversations and learn how people feel, you're not going to change this. The dynamics that we're dealing with are no different than in the 60s and 70s. We've always had these issues and we always will. It's how we respond to these events and how we build upon that and learn from it and improve. Unfortunately, right now you do hear a lot. I differ a little with Wendy on the media because a lot of them are sensationalized. But you probably haven't heard about the 2 officers in Cleveland, Ohio that were just killed. You probably can't name their names. You can't name the names of the Toledo officer that was killed recently. And these situations are not more important or less important, but it is part of the topic that we have to move on. With the COVID situation, it added that other layer, as a judge and officer said. We're not able to get out and deal with the people like we should. We're putting on dynamics of being liquor enforcement. We're putting on dynamics of being park patrol police and kicking people off of playgrounds. So we have to work together in the situation to build up those relationships, work with people and have those conversations. So I agree with everyone here, but we need to remember 98% of police are actually trying to do the best they can, and we need to support those that are doing those community efforts.
Thank you for that, Chief. We have another question from Gary Silva. It's a follow-up to Judge Hart. Do government officials place law enforcement in precarious positions by tasking them with carrying out non-enforceable and often political-based tasks? In this case, the pandemic aspects of social distancing, face coverings, etc. The situation can quickly turn bad and police are then criticized for being involved in the first place.
Well, I would never say that the police could not do what they're asked to do. I don't necessarily think that's a question. The question is, should they be doing it? Should a police officer tell somebody to put a mask, and if you don't put a mask, you can't go into this store? I mean, that was a big issue about how do you enforce. I think the former Boston commissioner, and he talked about that. How do you, we had in New York, we had this COVID task force. We had an actual 3-star chief in charge of this COVID task force to try to enforce social distancing in stores. In the beginning, how many people were in supermarkets? How were they spaced at the checkout? So it is difficult because whenever you have the police, the main role of the police is to enforce law and order. We do have a robust program in New York City with neighborhood policing, trying to get back to basics. But as I said before, when you give police officers a task, it's interpreted as a law enforcement task. It's given to them to enforce. So when you do that, it's not that it's impossible, it just causes friction. Nobody wants to be told they can't do X because they don't have a mask on. Nobody likes to be told you can't do this because you're not 6 feet away from somebody. So inherently, when it doesn't matter if it's the police, could be anybody. When anybody's told to do or not to do something in these circumstances, it's going to cause friction. So I do think there's a valid discussion to be had as to whether or not the police should be the ones enforcing this. But the problem, when things go bad, we've had situations where things have gone bad, where members of the public said, you're not wearing a mask, and the fight starts, breaks out. Police aren't there. The police aren't the ones who are doing enforcing. So the public has a vital role here to act like normal human beings as well. I mean, we're talking about a public health crisis. We're talking about all these other things. It would be a lot easier and a lot better if everybody just said, okay, we're in a public health crisis, let's follow the rules. But no. So if the police get involved, it's an indication that somebody's not following the rules, and then you get negative consequences as a result. So I don't think it's an impossible task. I just think it's an unfortunate task.
Professor Calloway, I've been on this panel with you long enough. I can just look at your face and tell you have something to say. So go ahead.
Well, I feel like a sort of theme is developing here that I want to address. I understand if we're going to accept for purposes of our discussion that the police are being asked to do something and maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. So what do we do? I would like to suggest that if the police are getting involved in situations where maybe they don't think it's appropriate or whatever, but it's not their decision to make, that doesn't mean that they need to kick the door in and start shooting people. And so perhaps the conversation needs to be about, like, how are these officers making decisions about how to get involved and where to get involved? The commissioner said that the police are there ultimately to enforce law and order. But we know that the police enforce the law and order some of the time and some of the places to some of the people, right? In my city, the stay-at-home order was being enforced against the Black folks. The white people were free to go about their day in the parks and doing whatever they want. The public intoxication laws and the open container laws and things like that are enforced pretty seriously in over the Rhine and in places where Black people hang out, but I can walk around in my neighborhood with an open container and no one's going to say boo to me. So when we decide how we're going to enforce and how we're going to get involved in these difficult conversations, the choices we make can create a lot of resentment and a lot of tension in the community that we're working in. And so if we're going to say, well, we have to do this because people are saying we have to do it, I think we need to look more carefully at exactly how the police are being deployed, when they're being deployed, who they're being deployed against.
Yeah, I definitely.
Just in New York City, I will give you an example. It's amazing how, we have this 311, the non-emergency calls to the police. Amazing how many 311 calls that came into the police department as, this this house of worship is not following the rules, or this restaurant is not, or this barbershop is not doing the rules. It's not following the rules. And a lot of the things that we came across was because of those. We didn't, like I say, we weren't targeting anybody per se. But Professor, I agree with you in that, yes, there is issues with disparate policing, no doubt about it. And that's, New York has just gone through a whole episode, and it's still dealing with it with the criminal justice reform. How do we enforce our laws? Why is there a disparity between population and arrests depending on race? And I teach this stuff too, so I'm up on this. I'm up on this as well. And a lot of the students I teach community college, they are of color, and I ask them, what has been their experience? And I will say this, give you an example of discretion. Yes, part of it is disparate policing. We have to get to the issue as to why. Is it racism? Certainly, that's part of it. I'll give you, but I think that discretion and that decision making has to be involved. I was telling Ms. Martin of an episode when I was a judge. There was a young man, I was sitting in night court, and there was a young man who came out. He was 16 years old. At the time, this is before we had the raise the age, so now it's 18, so he wouldn't be arrested at 16, he'd go to family court. But he was arrested for violating a ordinance that said you can't take up 2 seats on a subway. So this young man basically stayed in jail because he had no ID. He stayed in jail overnight. He was Latino. Stayed in jail overnight because he didn't have ID and he was taking up 2 seats on a subway. Now, forget about whether or not, what was going through the police officer's mind or whatever. I remember that kid coming out before me, and I literally apologized. And I went to the cops. We're not getting into, the whole idea of how arraignments work in New York City. And I said, I apologize. And I said, I turned to the cops. I said, what? Not the police officer, but I said, what is going on? And the DA, I said, what are you doing? So this kid forever had this bad experience with the police. He had no record, nothing. And that's another problem. Arrests, even if they're ultimately dismissed, they have consequences. Mm-hmm. So, that's why I say it's not like, we'll take care of it later. I mean, some people have the attitudes, we'll just deal with it. No, they have consequences. It's not like, we'll let the criminal. That's a decision that was made that I thought was a poor decision. I told this to the police commissioner, and, he agrees. He's very, Commissioner Shea here is very aware, very understanding, and is in tune with this idea of decisions. How we make decisions, how we use our discretion. In fact, he brought up a case where because of policy, this 8-year-old kid or 6-year-old kid was put in handcuffs because he was acting out in class. I mean, who does? That's not a right decision, So again, this whole idea of disparate policing, whether or not the criminal justice system is racially biased, all that stuff, but discretion is a big part of that.
Thanks for listening to part 2 of this special Encore series where we took a look back at equitable policing during the coronavirus pandemic. Check back on November 1st for the third and final part of this series when the panelists address more questions from the original viewing audience surrounding policing during the coronavirus pandemic, followed by closing remarks from former CEO Marcia Ferranto. We thank you for your support, and remember, our upcoming episode releases are every Wednesday, and published exclusively on Tuesdays is our monthly Icons episode. We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.